Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. We have a lot of people who have registered for this event. This is, I think, nearly the 25th year that Tom has held this Boxing Day reading for us, and we're very grateful to him for keeping this beautiful tradition up. Because we have so many people, I am going to keep everyone muted. But we will take questions at the end. If you have a question or two, the chat feature will be available to you. In addition, I will be recording this, so we can look at it again later if we like. Tom, are you ready to get started?
Yep, I can begin.
Okay.
All right. Well, once again, we can't be in the North Cornwall Church, but ironically, there are so many more people viewing this than have ever been in the North Cornwall Church for any of my readings. But that's our new world, our funny new world. Vladimir Nabokov. Some people say Nabokov, some people say Nabokov. And some people, when I mentioned that I was reading Nabokov, they said, "No, you're not reading that, are you?" And well, this is memory. This is his childhood. This is not Lolita. This is not Pale Horse, Invitation to a Beheading, etc. Nabokov was many, many things. He was a great language teacher. He was a great lepidopterist, seeker of butterflies. His collections are in university collections to this day. He was born in 1899 to a very, very wealthy aristocratic family in St. Petersburg. They had a big estate south of St. Petersburg where a lot of this narration takes place. His father, though, was a noted jurist, a liberal intellectual who tried to make sense of the chaos of the pre-World War I Russian situation, which was an almost impossible task. And he was part of the Kerensky government after the February Revolution in 1917, but eventually they had to flee. They fled to the Crimea and then to Berlin, where tragically in 1922, Nabokov's father was assassinated trying to protect the intended target at a political meeting and died. And his mother went to live in Prague, and he passed many years in Berlin as a language teacher, thanks to all those tutors and governesses who had taught him French and English and German and of course Russian. And he also coached tennis apparently in those years. And then he made it to Paris with his wife Vera and a little son Dmitri, getting away from the Nazi business. And then they were on one of the last boats to leave France in May of 1940, before the invasion. And he ended up being a language teacher at Wellesley and then at Cornell for many, many, many years, and was very much in touch with the whole literary world of Europe and the United States, wrote for the New Yorker. In fact, many of these passages from Speak Memory, his autobiographical collection, appeared in the New Yorker originally. And of course, then he wrote Lolita, which became a sensation and made him very, very wealthy. And the last years of his life, the last 15 actually, he and Vera lived on the top floor of a hotel in Lausanne, Switzerland, quite comfortably, and he continued his work. He didn't just stop. And biography of Gogol and translating Pushkin and more work and creation for our wonderful legacy. This is a book very much about memory and about his youth. And I have a little picture here of him as a 5-year-old, which maybe you can see. There he is with his father, looking very dapper in his sailor suit. And before I begin, I want to take one other moment to remember something of my own past. In the late 50s and early 60s, I got to know a very regal and elegant and wonderful lady named Mrs. May. And Mrs. May was my playmate, Sandra Winkelhorn McClellan's grandmother. And in an earlier life, in Russia. She was the Countess Kutuzov. And when the Bolsheviks took over, she had to flee like the Nabokovs. And she took the two little girls and a servant and a butler across the Caucasus Mountains by horseback. And one of those little girls was Sandra's mother, Savka, whom I knew so very well. And they ended up in northern Turkey, where the Countess Kutuzov befriended a British officer, and he snuck them onto a British warship, and they eventually made their way to Italy and then went on to Paris and New York and freedom. So that's a small connection in my life, and needless to say, Sandra's, to the world that I'm going to be reading about. We are all in an interconnected small world, and God willing, it will hold itself together for a little while longer. So I'm reading from chapters 4 and 5 of this book, and it'll be about 45 minutes, I think. Chapter 4, Speak Memory by Vladimir Nabokov. The kind of Russian family to which I belonged, a kind now extinct, had among other virtues a traditional leaning toward the comfortable products of Anglo-Saxon civilization. Pear soap, tar black when dry, topaz-like when held to the light between wet fingers, took care of one's morning bath. Pleasant was the decreasing weight of the English collapsible tub when it was made to protrude a rubber underlip and disgorge its frothy contents into a slop pail. We could not improve the cream, so we improved the tube, said the English toothpaste. At breakfast, golden syrup imported from London would entwist with its glowing coils the revolving spoon from which enough of it had slithered onto a piece of Russian bread and butter. All sorts of snug, mellow things came in a steady procession from the English shop on Nevsky Avenue. Fruitcakes, smelling salts, playing cards, picture puzzles, striped blazers, talcum white tennis balls. I learned to read English before I could read Russian. My first English friends were 4 simple souls in my grammar: Ben, Dan, Sam, and Ned. There used to be a great deal of fuss about their identities and whereabouts. Who is Ben? He is Dan. Sam is in bed, and so on. All through it all, remained rather stiff and patchy. The compiler was handicapped by having to employ, for initial lessons at least, words of not more than 3 letters. My imagination somehow managed to obtain the necessary data. Wan-faced, big-limbed, silent nitwits, proud in the possession of certain tools. Ben has an axe. They now drift with a slow-motioned slouch across the remotest backdrop of memory, and akin to the mad alphabet of an optician's chart, the grammar book lettering looms again before me. The schoolroom was drenched with sunlight. In a sweating glass jar, several spiny caterpillars were feeding on nettle leaves and ejecting interesting barrel-shaped pellets of olive green frass. The oilcloth that covered the round table smelled of glue. Miss Clayton smelled of Miss Clayton. Fantastically, gloriously, the blood-colored alcohol of the outside thermometer had risen to 24 Réaumur, 86 Fahrenheit in the shade. Through the window, one could see kerchiefed peasant girls weeding a garden path on their hands and knees, or gently raking the sun-mottled sand. The happy days when they would be cleaning streets and digging canals for the state were still beyond the horizon. Golden orioles in the greenery emitted their 4 brilliant notes, D, del, D, O. Ned lumbered past the window in a fair impersonation of the gardener's mate Ivan, who was to become in 1918 a member of the local Soviet. On later pages, longer words appeared, and at the very end of the brown ink-stained volume, a real sensible story unfolded its adult sentences. One day, Ted said to Anne, "Let us," the little reader's ultimate triumph and reward. I was thrilled by the thought that someday I might attain such proficiency. The magic has endured, and whenever a grammar book comes my way, I instantly turn to the last page to enjoy a forbidden glimpse of the laborious student's future, of that promised land where at last words are meant to mean what they mean. Summer, sumerki, the lovely Russian word for dusk. Time, a dim point in the first decade of this unpopular century. Place, latitude 59 degrees north from your equator, longitude 100 east from my writing hand. The day would take hours to fade, and everything, sky, tall flowers, still water, would be kept in a state of infinite vesperal suspense, deepened rather than resolved by the doleful moo of a cow in a distant meadow, or by the still more moving cry that came from some bird beyond the lower course of the river, where the vast expanse of a misty blue sphagnum bog, because of its mystery and remoteness, the Rukavishnikov children had baptized America. In the drawing room of our country house before going to bed, I would often be read to in English by my mother. As she came to a particularly dramatic passage where the hero was about to encounter some strange, perhaps fatal danger, her voice would slow down. Her words would be spaced portentously. And before turning the page, she would place upon it her hand with its familiar pigeon blood ruby and diamond ring, within the limpid facets of which, had I been a better crystal gazer, I might have seen a room, people, lights, trees in the rain, a whole period of emigre life for which that ring was to pay. There were tales about knights whose terrific but wonderfully aseptic wounds were bathed by damsels in grottos. From a wind-swept clifftop, medieval maiden with flying hair and a youth in hose gazed at the round Isles of the Blessed. In Misunderstood, the fate of Humphrey used to bring a more specialized lump to one's throat than anything in Dickens or Daudet, great devisers of lumps. While a shamelessly allegorical story, Beyond the Blue Mountains, dealing with two pairs of little travelers, Good Clover and Cowslip, Bad Buttercup and Daisy, contained enough excitement details to make one forget its message. There were also those large, flat, glossy picture books. I particularly liked the blue-coated, red-trousered, coal-black Gollywog, whose underclothes buttons for eyes, and his meager harem of 5 wooden dolls. By the illegal method of cutting themselves frocks out of the American flag, Peg taking the motherly stripes, Sarah Jane the pretty stars, 2 of the dolls acquired a certain soft femininity once their neutral articulations had been clothed. The twins, Meg and Weg, and the midget remained stark naked and consequently sexless. We see them in the dead of night stealing out of doors to sling snowballs at one another until the chimes of a remote clock. But hark, comments the rhymed text, send them back to their toy box in the nursery. A rude jack-in-the-box shoots out, frightening my lovely Sarah, and that picture I heartily disliked because it reminded me of children's parties at which this or that graceful little girl who had bewitched me happened to pinch her finger or hurt her knee and would forthwith expand into a purple-faced goblin, all wrinkles and bawling mouth. Another time they went on a bicycle journey and were captured by cannibals. Our unsuspecting travelers had been quenching their thirst at a palm-fringed pool when the tom-toms sounded. Over the shoulder of my past, I admire again the crucial picture. The Gollywog, still on his knees by the pool, but no longer drinking. His hair stands on end, and the normal black of his face has changed to a weird ashen hue. There was also the motorcar book. Sarah Jane, always my favorite, sporting a long green veil with the usual sequel, crutches and bandaged heads. And yes, the airship. Yards and yards of yellow silk went to make it, and an additional tiny balloon was provided for the sole use of the fortunate midget. At the immense altitude to which the ship reached, The aeronauts huddled together for warmth, while the lost little soloist, still the object of my intense envy notwithstanding his plight, drifted into an abyss of frost and stars, alone. I next see my mother leading me bedward through the enormous hall, where a central flight of stairs swept up and up, with nothing but hothouse-like panes of glass between the upper landing and the light green evening sky. One would lag back and shuffle and slide a little on the smooth stone floor of the hall, causing the gentle hand at the small of one's back to propel one's reluctant frame by means of indulgent pushes. Upon reaching the stairway, my custom was to get to the steps by squirming under the handrail between the newel post and the first banister. With every new summer, the process of squeezing through became more difficult. Nowadays, my ghost would get stuck. Another part of the ritual was to ascend with closed eyes. Step, 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 came my mother's voice as she led me up, and sure enough, the surface of the next tread would receive the blind child's confident foot. All one had to do was lift it a little higher than usual, so as to avoid stubbing one's toe against the riser. This slow, somewhat somnambulistic. Please remember to mute yourself. This slow, somewhat somnambulistic ascension in self-engendered darkness held obvious delights. The keenest of them was not knowing when the last step would come. At the top of the stairs, one's foot would be automatically lifted to the deceptive call of step, and then with a momentary sense of exquisite panic, with a wild contraction of muscles, would sink into the phantasm of a step, padded, as it were, with the infinitely elastic stuff of its own non-existence. It is surprising what method there was in my bedtime dawdling. True, the whole going up the stairs business now reveals a certain transcendental values. Actually, however, I was merely playing for time by extending every second to its utmost. This would still go on when my mother turned me over to be undressed to Miss Clayton or Mademoiselle. There were 5 bathrooms in our country house and a medley of venerable washstands. One of these I would seek out in its dark nook whenever I had been crying, so as to feel on my swollen face, which I was ashamed to show, the healing touch of its groping jet while I stepped on the rusty pedal. Regular baths were taken in the evening. For morning ablutions, the round rubber English tub were used. Mine was about 4 feet in diameter with a knee-high rim. Upon the lathered back of the squatting child, a jug full of water was carefully poured by an aproned servant. Its temperature varied with the hydrotherapeutic notions of successive mentors. There was that bleak period of dawning puberty when an icy deluge was decreed by our current tutor, who happened to be a medical student. On the other hand, the temperature of one's evening bath remained pleasantly constant at 28 degrees Réaumur, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, as measured by a large kindly thermometer whose wooden sheathing with a bit of damp string in the eye of the handle allowed it to share in the buoyancy of celluloid goldfishes and little swans. The toilets were separate from the bathrooms, and the oldest among them was a rather sumptuous but gloomy affair with some fine panel work and a tasseled rope of red velvet, which when pulled produced a beautifully modulated, discreetly muffled gurgle and gulp. From that corner of the house, one could see Hesperus and hear the nightingales, and it was there that later I used to compose my youthful verse, dedicated to unembraced beauties, and morosely survey in a dimly illuminated mirror the immediate erection of a strange castle in an unknown Spain. As a small child, however, I was assigned a more modest arrangement. Rather casually situated in a narrow recess between a wicker hamper and the door leading to the nursery bathroom. This door I liked to keep ajar, though I drowsily looked at the shimmer of steam above the mahogany bath, at the fantastic flotilla of swans and skiffs, at myself with a harp in one of the boats, at a furry moth clinging against the reflector of the kerosene lamp, at the stained glass window beyond, at its two halberdiers consisting of colored rectangles. Bending from my warm seat, I like to press the middle of my brow, its ophiron, to be precise, against the smooth, comfortable edge of the door, and then roll my head a little so that the door would move to and fro while its edge remained all the time in soothing contact with my forehead. A dreamy rhythm would permeate my being. The recent step, step, step would be taken up by a dripping faucet, and fruitfully combining rhythmic pattern with rhythmic sound, I would unravel the labyrinthian frets on the linoleum and find faces where a crack or a shadow afforded a point de repère for the eye. I appeal to parents. Never, never say, hurry up to a child. The final stage in the course of my vague navigation would come when I reached the island of my bed. From the veranda or drawing room where life was going on without me, my mother would come up for the warm murmur of her goodnight kiss. Closed inside shutters, a lighted candle, gentle Jesus, meek and mild, something, something little child, the child kneeling on the pillow that presently would engulf his humming head. English prayers and the little icon featuring a suntanned Greek Catholic saint formed an innocent association upon which I look back with pleasure. And above the icon, high up on the wall, where the shadow of something of the bamboo screen between bed and door, undulated in the warm candlelight. A framed aquarelle showed a dusky path winding through one of those eerily dense European beechwoods, where the only undergrowth is bindweed and the only sound one's thumping heart. In an English fairy tale my mother had once read to me, a small boy stepped out of his bed into a picture and rode his hobby horse along a painted path between silent trees. While I knelt on my pillow in a mist of drowsiness and talc powdered well-being, half sitting on my calves and rapidly going through my prayer, I imagined the motion of climbing into the picture above my bed and plunging into that enchanted beechwood, which I did visit in due time. A bewildering sequence of English nurses and governesses, some of them wringing their hands, others smiling at me enigmatically, come out to meet me as I re-enter my past. There was dim Miss Rachel, whom I remember mainly in terms of Huntley and Palmer biscuits, the nice almond rocks at the top of the blue papered tin box and the insipid cracknels at the bottom, which she unlawfully shared with me after my teeth had been brushed. There was Miss Clayton, who when I slumped in my chair would poke me in the middle vertebrae and then smilingly throw back her own shoulders to show what she wanted of me. She told me a nephew of hers at my age, 4, used to breed caterpillars, but those she collected for me in an open jar with nettles all walked away one morning, and the gardener said they had hanged themselves. There was lovely black-haired aquamarine-eyed Miss Norcott, who lost a white kid glove at Nice or Beaulieu, where I vainly looked for it on the shining beach among the colored pebbles and the glaucous lumps of sea-changed bottle glass. Lovely Miss Norcott was asked to leave at once one night in Abbazia. She embraced me in the morning twilight of the nursery, pale, macintoshed, and weeping like a Babylonian willow. And that day I remained inconsolable, despite the hot chocolate that the Petersons' old nanny had made especially for me, and the special bread and butter on the smooth surface of which my aunt, Nata, adroitly capturing my attention, drew a daisy, then a cat, then a little mermaid, whom I had just been reading about with Miss Norcott and crying over too. So I started to cry again. There was myopic little Miss Hunt, whose short stay with us in Wiesbaden came to an end the day my brother and I actually, aged 4 and 5, respectively, managed to evade her nervous vigilance by boarding a steamer that took us quite a way down the Rhine before recapture. There was pink-nosed Miss Robinson. There was Miss Clayton again. There was one awful person who read me Marie Corelli's The Mighty Atom There were still others. At a certain point, they faded out of my life. French and Russian took over, and what little time remained for the speaking of English was devoted to occasional accessions with two gentlemen, Mr. Burness and Mr. Cummings, neither of whom dwelt with us. They are associated in my mind with winters in St. Petersburg, where we had a house on Morskaya Street. Mr. Burness was a large Scotsman with a florid face, light blue eyes, and lank straw-colored hair. He spent his mornings teaching at a language school and then crammed into the afternoon more private lessons than the day could well hold. Traveling as he did from one part of the town to another, and having to depend on the torpid trot of dejected izvozchik cab horses to get him to his pupils, he would be with luck only a quarter of an hour late for his 2 o'clock lesson, wherever that was, but would arrive after 5 or 4 o'clock for hours. The tension of waiting for him and hoping that for once his superhuman doggedness might balk before the gray wall of some special snowstorm was the kind of feeling that one trusts never to meet with in mature life, but that I did experience again when circumstances forced me in my turn to give lessons, when in my furnished rooms in Berlin I awaited a certain stone-faced pupil who would always turn up despite the obstacles I mentally piled in his way. The very darkness that was gathering outside seemed a waste product of Mr. Burness's efforts to reach our house. Presently, the valet would come to drop the blue voluminous blinds and draw the flowered window draperies. The tick-tock of the grandfather's clock in the schoolroom gradually assumed a dreary, nagging intonation. Please remember to mute yourself. There's some noise coming from somebody somewhere. The tightness of my shorts in the groin and the rough touch of ribbed black stockings rubbing against the tender inside of my bent legs would mingle with the dull pressure of a humble meal, the satisfaction of which I kept postponing. Nearly an hour would pass and there would be no sign of Mr. Burness. My brother would go to his room and play some practice piece on the piano, and then plunge and replunge into some of the melodies that I loathed. The instruction of the artificial flowers in Faust, Dites-lui, qu'elle est belle, or Vladimir Lensky's wail, Kuda, Kuda, Kuda vi udalilis. I would leave the upper floor where we children dwelt and slowly slide along the balustrade down to the second story where my parents' rooms were situated. As often as not, they used to be out at that time, and in the gathering dusk, the place acted upon my young senses in a curiously teleological way, as if this accumulation of familiar things in the dark were doing its utmost to form the definite and permanent image that repeated exposure did finally leave in my mind. The sepia gloom of an Arctic afternoon in midwinter invaded the rooms and was deepening to an oppressive black. Bronze angle, a surface of glass or polished mahogany here and there in the darkness, reflected the odds and ends of light from the street, where the globes of tall street lamps along its middle line were already diffusing their lunar glow. Gauzy shadows moved on the ceiling. In the stillness, the dry sound of chrysanthemum petal falling upon the marble of a table made one's nerves twang. My mother's boudoir had a convenient oriel for looking out on the Morskaya in the direction of Maria Square. With lips pressed against the thin fabric that veiled the window pane, I would gradually taste the cold of the glass through the gauze. From that oriel some years later, at the outbreak of the revolution, I watched various engagements and saw my first dead man. He was being carried away on a stretcher, and from one dangling leg, an ill-shod comrade kept trying to pull off the boot despite pushes and punches from the stretchermen, all this at a goodish trot. But in the days of Mr. Burness's lessons, there was nothing to watch, save the dark, muffled street and its receding line of loftily suspended lamps, around which the snowflakes passed and repassed with a graceful, almost deliberately slackened motion, as if to show how the trick was done and how simple it was. From another angle, one might see a more generous stream of snow in a brighter, violet-tinged nimbus of gaslight, and then the jutting enclosure where I stood would seem to drift slowly up and up like a balloon. At last, one of the phantom sleighs gliding along the street would come to a stop, and with gawky haste, Mr. Burness, in his fox-furred shapka, would make for our door. From the schoolroom whither I had preceded him, I would hear his vigorous footsteps crashing nearer and nearer. And no matter how cold the day was, his good ruddy face would be sweating abundantly as he strode in. I remember the terrific energy with which he pressed on the spluttering pen as he wrote down in the roundest of round hands the tasks to be prepared for the next day. Usually at the end of the lesson, a certain limerick was asked for and granted. The point of the performance being that the word screamed in it was to be involuntarily enacted by oneself every time Mr. Burness gave a formidable squeeze to the hand he held in his beefy paw as he recited the lines. There was a young lady from Russia who, woo, whenever you'd crush her, she woo, and she woo, by which time the pain would have become so excruciatingly dense that we never got any further. The quiet bearded gentleman with a stoop, old-fashioned Mr. Cummings, who taught me in 1907 and 1908 to draw, had been my mother's drawing master also. He had come to Russia in the early 90s as a foreign correspondent and illustrator for the London Graphic. Marital misfortunes were rumored to have obscured his life. A melancholy sweetness of manner made up for the meagerness of his talent. He wore an ulster unless the weather was very mild, when he would switch to a kind of greenish-brown woolen cloak called a loden. I was captivated by his use of the special eraser he kept in his waistcoat pocket, by the manner in which he held the page taut and afterwards flicked off with the back of his fingers the gutticles of the percha, as he said. Silently, sadly, he illustrated for me the marble laws of perspective. Long, straight strokes of his elegantly held, incredibly sharp pencil caused the lines of the room he created out of nothing, abstract walls, receding ceiling and floor, to come together in one remote, hypothetical point with tantalizing and sterile accuracy. Tantalizing because it made me think of railroad tracks, symmetrically and trickily converging before the bloodshot eyes of my favorite mask, the grimy engine driver. Sterile because that room remained unfurnished and quite empty, being devoid even of the neutral statues one finds in the uninteresting first hall of a museum. The rest of the picture gallery made up for its gaunt vestibule. Mr. Cummings was a master of the sunset. His little watercolors, purchased at different times for 5 or 10 rubles apiece by members of our household, led a somewhat precarious existence, shifting as they did to more and more obscure nooks and finally getting completely eclipsed by some sleek porcelain beast or a newly framed photograph. After I had learned not only to draw cubes and cones, but to shade properly with smooth, merging slants, such parts of them as had to be made to turn away forever, the kind old gentleman contented himself with painting under my enchanted gaze his own wet little paradises, variations of one landscape, a summer evening with an orange sky, a pasture ending in the black fringe of a distant forest, and a luminous river repeating the sky, winding away and away. Later on, from around 1910 to 1912, the well-known impressionist, a term of the period, Yaramish, took over. A humorless and formless person, he advocated a bold style, blotches of dull color, smears of sepia and olive brown, by means of which I had to reproduce on huge sheets of gray paper humanoid shapes that we modeled on of plasticine and placed in dramatic positions against a backcloth of velvet with all kinds of folds and shadow effects. It was a depressing combination of at least 3 different arts, all approximative, and finally, I rebelled. He was replaced by the celebrated Dobushinsky, who liked to give me lessons on the piano nobile of our house in one of its pretty reception rooms downstairs, which he entered in a particularly noiseless way, as if afraid to startle me from my verse-making stupor. He made me depict from memory, in the greatest possible detail, objects I had certainly seen thousands of times without visualizing them properly. A street lamp, a post box, without the tulip design on the stained glass of our own front door. He tried to teach me to find the geometrical coordinations between the slender twigs of a leafless boulevard tree, a system of visual give and takes requiring a precision of linear expression, which I failed to achieve in my youth, but applied gratefully in my adult instar, not only to the drawing of butterfly genitalia during my 7 years at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, when immersing myself in the bright well hole of a microscope to record in India ink this or that new structure, but also perhaps to certain camera lucida needs of literary composition. Emotionally, however, I am still indebted to the earlier color treats given me by my mother and her former teacher. How readily Mr. Cummings would sit down on a stool behind and part with both hands his what? Was he wearing a frock coat? I see only the gesture and proceed to open the black tin paint box. I loved the nimble way he had of soaking his paintbrush in multiple color to the accompaniment of a rapid clatter produced by the enamel containers wherein the rich reds and yellows that the brush dimpled were appetizingly cupped. And having thus collected its honey, it would cease to hover and poke, and by 2 or 3 sweeps of its lush tip would drench the Vatmansky paper with an even spread of orange sky, across which that sky was still dampish. A long purple-black cloud would be laid. And that's all, dearie, he would say. That's all there is to it. On one occasion, I had him draw an express train for me. I watched his pencil ably evolve the cowcatcher and elaborate headlights of a locomotive that looked as if it had been acquired secondhand for the Trans-Siberian line after it had done duty at Promontory Point, Utah in the 60s. Then came disappointingly plain carriages. When he had quite finished them, he carefully shaded the ample smoke coming from the huge funnel, cocked his head, and after a moment of pleased contemplation, handed me the drawing. I tried to look pleased too. He had forgotten the tender. A quarter of a century later, I learned 2 things. That Burness, by then dead, had been well known in Edinburgh as a scholarly translator of the Russian Romantic poems that had been the altar and frenzy of my boyhood. And that my humble drawing master, whose age I used to synchronize with that of granduncles and old family servants, had married a young Estonian girl about the time I myself married. When I learned these later developments, I experienced a queer shock. It was as if life had impinged upon my creative rights by wriggling on beyond the subjective limits so elegantly and economically set by childhood memories that I thought I had signed and sealed. And what about Yaremich? I asked M.V. Dobushinsky one summer afternoon in the 1940s as we strolled through a beech forest in Vermont. Is he remembered? Indeed he is, replied Mstislav Valerianovich. He was exceptionally gifted. I don't know what kind of teacher he was, but I do know that you were the most hopeless pupil I ever had. Now I'm going to take a sip of water and we'll move on to a brief passage from chapter 5. I have often noticed that after I had bestowed on the characters of my novels some treasured item of my past, it would pine away in the artificial world where I had so abruptly placed it. Although it lingered on my mind, its personal warmth, its retrospective appeal had gone, and presently it became more closely identified with my novel than with my former self, where it had seemed to be so safe from the intrusion of the artist. Houses have crumbled in my memory as soundlessly as they did in the mute films of yore, and the portrait of my old French governess, whom I once lent to a boy in one of my books, is fading fast now that it is engulfed in the description of a childhood entity unrelated to my own. The man in me revolts against the fictionist, and here is my desperate attempt to save what is left of poor Mademoiselle. A large woman, a very stout woman, Mademoiselle rolled into our existence in December 1905 when I was 6 and my brother 5. There she is. I see so plainly her abundant dark hair brushed up high and covertly graying, the 3 wrinkles on her austere forehead, her beetling brows, the steely eyes behind the black-rimmed pince-nez, the vestigial mustache, the blotchy complexion, which in moments of wrath develops an additional flush in the region of the 3rd and amplest chin, so regally spread over the frilled mountain of her blouse. And now she sits down, or rather she tackles the job of sitting down, the jelly of her jowl quaking her prodigious posterior, with the 3 buttons on the side, lowering itself warily. Then at the last second, she surrenders her bulk to the wicker armchair, which out of sheer fright bursts into a salvo of crackling. We had been abroad for about a year. After spending the summer of 1904 in Beaulieu and Albatia and several months in Wiesbaden, we left for Russia at the beginning of 1905. I fail to remember the month. One clue is that in Wiesbaden, I had been taken to its Russian church, the first time I had been to a church anywhere. And that might have been in the Lenten season. During the service, I asked my mother what the priest and the deacon were talking about. And she whispered back in English that they were saying we should all love one another. But I understood she meant that those 2 gorgeous personages in cone-shaped shining robes were telling each other that they would always remain good friends. From Frankfurt, we arrived in Berlin in a snowstorm, and the next morning caught the Nord Express, which thundered in from Paris. 12 hours later, it reached the Russian frontier. Against the background of winter, the ceremonial change of cars and engines acquired a strange new meaning. An exciting sense of Rodina, motherland, was for the first time organically mingled with the comfortably creaking snow, the deep footprints across it, the red gloss of the engine stack, the birch logs piled high under their private layer of transportable snow on the red tender. I was not quite 6, but that year abroad, a year of difficult decisions and liberal hopes, had exposed a small Russian boy to grown-up conversations. He could not help being affected in some way of his own by a mother's nostalgia and a father's patriotism. In result, that particular return to Russia, my first conscious return, seems to me now 60 years later a rehearsal, not of the grand homecoming that will never take place, but of its constant dream in my long years of exile. The summer of 1905 in Vaira, that's the Nabokov country state, Vaira, had not yet evolved Lepidoptera. The village schoolmaster took us for instructive walks. What you hear is the sound of the scythe being sharpened. That field there will be given a rest next season. Oh, just a small bird, no special name. If that peasant is drunk, it is because he is poor. Autumn carpeted the park with varicolored leaves, and Miss Robinson showed us the beautiful device which the ambassador's boy, a familiar character in her small world, had enjoyed so much the preceding autumn, of choosing on the ground and arranging on a big sheet of paper such maple leaves as would form an almost complete spectrum, minus the blue, a big disappointment, green shading into lemon, lemon into orange, and so on through the reds to purples, purplish browns, reddish again, and back through lemon to green, which was getting quite hard to find except as a part of a last brave edge. The first frosts hit the asters, and still we did not move to town. That winter of 1905, 1906, when Mademoiselle arrived from Switzerland, was the only one of my childhood that I spent in the country. It was a year of strikes, riots, police-inspired massacres, and I suppose my father wished to keep his family away from the city in our quiet country place, where his popularity with the peasants might mitigate, as correctly surmised, the risks of unrest. It was also a particularly severe winter, producing as much snow as Mademoiselle might have expected to find in the Hyperborean gloom of remote Muscovy. When she alighted in the little Siversky station, from which she still had to travel half a dozen miles by sleigh to Vira, I was not there to greet her, but I do so now as I try to imagine what she saw and felt at that last stage of her fabulous and ill-timed journey. Her Russian vocabulary consisted, I know, of one short word, the same solitary word that years later she was to take back to Switzerland. This word, which in her pronunciation may be phonetically rendered as giddy actually is gede with an as in yet, which meant where? And that was a good deal. Uttered by her like the raucous cry of some lost bird, it accumulated such interrogatory force that it sufficed for all her needs. Giddy, she would wail, not only to find out her whereabouts, but also to express supreme misery, the fact that she was a stranger, shipwrecked, penniless, ailing, in search of the blessed land where at last she would be understood. I can visualize her by proxy as she stands in the middle of the station platform, where she has just alighted, and vainly my ghostly envoy offers her an arm that she cannot see. There I was, abandoned by all, comme la Catesse, Caroline, she later complained eloquently, if not quite correctly. The door of the waiting room opens with a shuddering whine peculiar to nights of intense frost. A cloud of hot air rushes out, almost as profuse as the steam from the panting engine. And now our coachman, Zahar, takes over, a burly man in sheepskin with the leather outside, his huge gloves protruding from his scarlet sash into which he has stuffed them. I hear the snow crunching under his felt boots while he busies himself with the luggage, the jingling harness, and then his own nose, which he eases by means of a dexterous tweak and shake of finger and thumb as he trudges back around the sleigh, slowly with grim misgivings. Mademoiselle, as her helper, calls her. He climbs in, she climbs in, clutching at him in mortal fear lest the sleigh move off before her vast form is securely encased. Finally, she settles down with a grunt and thrusts her fists into her skimpy plush muff. At the juicy smack of their driver's lips, the two black horses, Zoika and Zinka, strain their quarters, shift hooves, strain again, and then Mademoiselle gives a backward jerk with her torso as the heavy sleigh is wrenched out of its world of steel, fur, flesh, to enter the frictionless medium where it skims along a spectral road that it seems barely to touch. For one moment, thanks to the sudden radiance of a lone lamp, where the station square ends, a grossly exaggerated shadow, also holding a muff, races behind the sleigh, climbs a billow of snow and is gone, leaving Mademoiselle to be swallowed up by what she will later allude to with awe and gusto as le steppe. There in the limitless gloom, the changeable twinkle of remote village lights seems to her to be the yellow eyes of wolves. She is cold, she is frozen stiff, frozen to the center of her brain, for she soars with the wildest hyperbole when not tagging after the most pedestrian dictum. Every now and then she looks back to make sure that a second sleigh bearing her trunk and hat box is following, always at the same distance, like those companionable phantoms of ships in polar waters which explorers have described. And let me not leave out the moon, for surely there must be a moon, the full, incredibly clear disk that goes so well with Russian lusty frosts. So there it comes, steering out of a flock of small dappled clouds, which it tinges with a vague iridescence, And as it sails higher, it glazes the runner tracks left on the road, where every sparkling lump of snow is emphasized by a swollen shadow. Very lovely, very lonesome. But what am I doing in this stereoscopic dreamland? How did I get here? Somehow the two sleighs have slipped away, leaving behind a passportless spy standing on the blue-white road of his New England snow boots and storm coat. The vibration in my ears is no longer their receding bells, but only my old blood singing. All is still, smellbound, enthralled by the moon, fancy's rear view vision mirror. The snow is real though, and as I blend to it and scoop up a handful, 60 years crumble to glittering frost dust between my fingers. And I'll still stop here. There's a lot left about the great Mademoiselle, and I recommend that you find the book eventually. They're all on Amazon, about 20 Nabokov books, but Speak Memory is predominant. And if the library doesn't have it, I'll give them this copy. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. That was beautiful. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions you could put in the chat for Tom?
There's a lot of stuff in the chat.
Yeah, but there was a ticking sound that was
Yeah,
that was a problem. But
All right.
nope, just a lot of thank you, beautifuls.
Yeah.
It was beautiful. No questions?
Somebody could make a great one-person show out of this book in some imaginative way. There's a
It's a
lot about
beautiful
his
book.
high school, around 1913, and the coming revolution. And he had the most amazing life, a charmed life, lucky in some ways, unlucky in others.
Hmm.
We should all be so lucky. Hopefully we won't find ourselves in war or invasion, or no more insurrections, please.
Well, it looks like everybody is just writing to say thank you and that they enjoyed it very much. So I guess we'll leave it at that, Tom.
All right, much
Thank
love
you
to you.
once again.
It's good to be in
Happy
touch with
holidays,
Cornwall,
everyone.
however vicariously. And I get all the Cornwall community network posts. So you know what that is, nonstop. So I'm very much still in Cornwall, a child of Cornwall. I will always remain.
Well, we're happy about that. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Happy holidays, Happy New Year. And hope to see you in the library soon. Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.